Revived Thoughts is a production of Revive Studios.
We are bringing you the third part of our deep dive on Ethiopia. Now, if you do not know, this is a part of what is normally behind our Patreon paywall. We are releasing it to you so that you can listen to it and get the opportunity to enjoy this story. Now, this is part 3. There was a first part and a second part that we released last summer. However, if you have not listened to those earlier parts, you don't need to. You can jump into the story where it is, and you'll probably be able to pick up and understand what's going on. However, we do encourage you to go back and listen to those first and second parts. They cover the first 1,300 or so years of Christianity in Ethiopia. And this last episode kind of wraps up all of those missing pieces and things that we've been going through. So it's great if you can listen to part 1 and 2. I do think you could understand part 3 without them, without the layers. It won't be maybe quite as good. But just to set you up, if you haven't gone through part 1 and part 2, Ethiopia is a somewhat Christian country that is in Africa. There have been times when spiritual fervor was very high, and there have been times when spiritual fervor wasn't really that high. And the Ethiopian Empire was at one point very strong, and it had gotten weakened, almost completely destroyed during the time of the Zagwe dynasty, just a little piece of the map. And then under the new dynasty that took back over, they just completely demolished their enemies and built themselves up into this giant kingdom. But at the same time, they really put forward the idea, the kings of Ethiopia really hammered in the idea that they were descended from King Solomon and King David. They were the heirs of that reign. They were kind of building a new Jerusalem, and that they were not to be questioned. They were, God's anointed kings, and that they themselves had the Ark of the Covenant, and that Ethiopia was this new Christian empire in the middle of Africa. And if you don't know the story, again, I highly encourage you to go listen to parts 1 and 2 where we go through how all of this kind of came to be. But this is the world that we're stepping into. And in this episode, a man is going to challenge all of this. And he's going to say, hey, this doesn't look like what I think the Bible is telling me to look like. And you are going to have, I think, a very difficult time not drawing parallels to this man, Estifanos in Ethiopia, who is the man who does this, and Martin Luther in the Reformation that happens in Europe. They have a lot of overlaps and a lot of similarities. And yet, there's one big key difference between their reformations, and we talk about what that key difference is and how that goes. So this is the story of Ethiopia. This is the last part that we started on that series. Up until now, it's been in the Patreon where you could have found it. Also behind the Patreon is our Joan of Arc deep dive, where we go through and walk through her entire story and tell you and give our answer to the question, did she actually hear, from the voice of God? On the deep dives and in the Patreons, you can also find our look into the Salem witch trials. Were there demons in Salem? What was with the witchcraft? What was going on there? And we also have another episode on the First Crusade. What kicked off Europe deciding to invade Jerusalem, and why did they do something like that? And we have just these deep thoughts that we're doing. We'll very soon have one out on the London fire of 1666 and how that quite literally transformed the world, and how yet most people don't even hardly know it exists. So those are other future and previous deep dives we have done. But now, without any further, anything else to say, let's get you into deep dive part 3 in Ethiopia. This is Troy and Joel, and you are listening to Revive Thoughts.
Troy, I am excited to get to the end of our Ethiopia journey. We know how they were established. We know what their rise to power was. Now, what is this pre-Reformation thing that happens here? This is part 3 of our Church of Ethiopia deep dive. If you haven't listened to the first 2 parts, you got to listen to those. These all build on that episode, so go back and check those out. Yeah. But now...
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go. I don't mean to interrupt you.
So this style of deep dive has been a little different, where I'm kind of telling the story, and Joel's job is to be the audience, to tell us, hey, where am I missing things and where am I not being clear? And he's hearing all of this for the first time, much like you are, and hopefully answering and asking questions like that you would hear and want to know At the same time, we've been in this story now for 2 hours, and we're only just now getting up to what I originally set up was the question that this whole deep dive was meant to answer, which was I was sitting at a diner and a friend of mine said, "Hey, did John Calvin and the Reformation guys, the boys in the Reformation, did they steal
The
the
boys.
Reformation from the Church of Ethiopia?" That's how they like to be known, the boys in the Reformation. And did they steal that Reformation from this church in Ethiopia? And I will tell you that by the end of this episode, I can confidently answer that question, but it is slightly more complex than just a straightforward yes or no. And I do want to give you that kind of thing. And the best way to do that is to actually tell you that story and let you kind of see through it, because it is actually this really amazing and interesting and quite frankly, tragic story of the church and what happened in Ethiopia. It's very sad. And I think we need to hear it. And I think it's good for us to learn about this very sad moment in church history, even if, we're very far removed from it, hundreds of years. And yet I think we can learn a lot from this tragic tale. When we ended it last episode, when we kind of came to a close, Amde the Conqueror has taken Ethiopia, built an empire. She's big, she's back, and she's ready to go. He's written this document saying that, the kings are now officially a hereditary line of Solomon. We took a detour during the Zagwe dynasty, but we're back. The Solomon line is back. These are the kings that descend from David himself. And we have rebuilt, and the Zagwe dynasty built this Jerusalem-like city. We're rebuilding Jerusalem. We have Jewish people in the land. Don't forget they're there too. We're surrounded by Muslim enemies, yet we are going to be this new heaven on earth, basically. We're going to rule this land, but it's not going to be easy. And his son, if Amde's nickname is the Conqueror, his son's name ends up being the Sword of Terror. And this is the names of the type of tough men that run Ethiopia. And they are very afraid of losing Ethiopia. Muslims are rebelling all the time. This is a very precarious place they're in. And the very thing they're afraid of is actually what ends up happening to them. So they're right to be afraid of it. It doesn't happen to them when they think it will, but it does end up happening. So that fear that someday the Muslims will gang up and defeat us, that's exactly what does occur. Even though it's Africa and it happened before the Protestant Reformation, there's a very central figure to the African almost Reformation that we're looking at. If the Protestant Reformation focuses on Martin Luther, right? He's that beginning guy. And yes, there were other people before him and during his time, but we look at Martin Luther and him nailing the 95 Theses, and we see this very clear moment before and after where the Reformation has begun and things are changing. There's a very, very, very similar man in the African version as well. He's born in the year 1380, and his name is Estifanos, or he'll go by Abba Estifanos. Abba means father, Estifanos, Father Estifanos. And the thing is, I'm not trying to draw these parallels for you, but there's no denying these guys have a very, very similar story. Estifanos was not born to a particularly well-off family. Unlike Europe's Martin Luther, he did not know his dad. His dad was a warrior of the village, but before he was even born, he died in what seems like combat. And when he was born, they gave him the name Estifanos, which meant reminiscent of the lion. And with a name like that, you would have expected him to grow up to want to be a warrior like his dad. And that's what everyone in the village, everyone in his family wanted him to be. But like Martin Luther, Estifanos didn't want to be a warrior of the village. He didn't want to, not that Luther's dad was pushing him to be Luther to be a lawyer, and he wanted to go work for the church. And Estifanos' family was pushing him to be this warrior, but he wanted to go be a monk, and he wanted to go work at the churches too. Estifanos grew up with his mother at his uncle's house, and they always put this pressure, grow up to be a warrior. And eventually he kind of runs away from home to go and be a monk and get away from all of that. He makes amends with his family, but he makes it clear, I'm going for the church. I want to be that kind of person. I don't want to be a warrior. He gets to a school for monks, and at the age of 18, after he's been there for a while, they care for him, they kind of raise him for a while, and he gets to be made a deacon of that church. But he was driven by this desire to know God. Much like Martin Luther, he just never felt saved. He just struggled with this idea that He'd gotten it. He was like, I just feel like I'm missing something. He believed in God. He loved the church, but he just felt like there just was something there. So he decides to kind of go looking for answers after a few years. He goes searching for it. And if you're familiar with the stories of great men, we've gone over so many men like this on Revived Thoughts. You can see a similar story. John Wesley, St. Augustine. There's so many people who struggle with this. And it's impossible not... Go ahead.
Can you tell us what the general, if you had to like, broadly generalize what the main religion in Ethiopia is at this moment, right? Because they're not really Roman Catholic. They're obviously not quite Protestant. Like, what is their belief structure that this pre-Protestant style movement is being birthed from? What is the environment that this
yes, a good question.
is in?
So you'll kind of see it here in a minute when I detail what his life looks like. A very similar system of Catholic-like faith has taken over Ethiopia. While honestly, all of the Orthodox churches struggle with this, a little bit of rituals and rites and stuff like that. But while the church, remember, Ethiopia, when they set war for the first time on that city, they got cut off for 70 years. And during those 70 years, no bishops, nobody could check on them. And when they came back, they found some weird stuff had taken over, a lot of ritualistic rites and rules and ideas. And this actually, during Estifanos' lifetime, they start worshiping like statues of Mary. A lot of the same stuff that Martin Luther 100 years later will say, hey, we don't need to do this. That's what Estifanos is up against. This like idea of worshiping idols, this idea of just working to earn your salvation and a lack of assurance of faith. The environment of Ethiopia in the early 1400s is just so similar to what was going on in Martin Luther's Germany, where it's just, they're not selling indulgences, but they're saying you have to basically earn it. The priests they're also saying the priests are Levites. The king is a God king, from Jerusalem days, and whatever they say goes. And you've got to do what they say, and you've got to worship the Ark of the Covenant statue we put in the middle of your church, and you got to worship the statue of Mary, and you've got to say this prayer, and you've got to do this ritual. But it's okay if you drink. You drink as much as you want, right? It's okay if you do these other things. It's fine. As long as you do the works, you're saved. And it's very much that works-based salvation. Again, very similar to what Martin Luther had. And Estefanos could never find that assurance of his faith. And so he looked for it. So he actually kind of goes off and goes to the main church of Ethiopia to be trained by the biggest monastery there is. And he follows all the rules in the church to do this, do this, do this. They have all these man-made rules, prayers, fasts, don't eat for 10 days, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And Estefanos does all of it. He's like their most diligent guy. And at the age of 30, they go, hey, we love you, Estefanos. I think you're great. We want to make you a priest. But even after being made a priest, Estefanos still just doesn't feel any assurance in his faith. He still thinks like, I'm missing something. So he makes another pilgrimage. Actually, after that, he made multiple pilgrimages. He fasted. He would push himself very hard. He desperately wanted to know God. He would go and get ordained like twice during this time. He just kept doing all these different things to just find some assurance, and just never came. And again, just so similar to Martin Luther. Augustine has this quote. Augustine also famously spent years searching for the truth. And he says, our heart is restless till it finds its rest in you. And Estefanos really feels like a guy who just could not find rest because he could not find Christ. As Estefanos is looking for something different, he hears about a man living pretty close to the monastery who is a hermit. This man had been exiled from Ethiopia's churches because he had preached a different doctrine than what was currently acceptable inside Ethiopia, at least this part of Ethiopia. He had been a famous and renowned priest in the main part of the churches of the East. He'd been very famous in Alexandria, but when he came to Ethiopia to preach those same doctrines, Ethiopia pushed him out. He happened to have been exiled pretty close to where Estefanos is. So Estefanos makes a trip to go see him and says, maybe this guy has some answers. Maybe he can kind of help me figure out why I don't feel like I have a faith. Up until this point, it's important to note that much like Luther, Estefanos is very well educated, been ordained twice by the Orthodox Church. He wasn't stupid. At the same time, though, he just wasn't properly educated in the faith. when he arrives to this guy just teaches him the basic biblical doctrines of salvation. Jesus Christ paid the price for sin. Yeah, but what works do we have to do? No, like Jesus Christ paid that price of sin. The Bible is where we learn this. The simple stuff that we think of as making you a Christian. Jesus is the son of God. He's also God. He paid the price of sin. He died on the cross. He took all the work, all that kind of stuff. But that wasn't what was currently being taught in Ethiopia. They had all this extra stuff added on. And when he heard this guy teaching it, he said he just felt convicted. And suddenly, all at once, like he could just see differently. Like his eyes were just like, oh my gosh, I understand it now. I understand the faith for the first time. And boom, he said he felt free. And he immediately began to tell others about this new teaching he had learned from the hermit. And the monks started saying, you're just a different guy. He no longer spent all his time doing these worship rituals. He was no longer doing the insane fasting. He no longer drank alcohol. He suddenly spent all his free time reading the Bible, meditating on the words, and telling people about what he was learning. He just seemed like a different man. He would then write the scriptures down on pieces of paper and sell them for money. And so when they gave him money, he could then use that to write more and sell them again. It was about a penny to get a scripture. And so they were kind of working back and forth just enough to get the scriptures out to more people. And others began listening to his teaching, and they loved what he was saying. They loved the scriptures. They were having their lives changed as well by just the simple preaching. Again, they had the scripture, they had the Bible, but no one was reading it. No one was understanding it because they just had lost that idea of justified by faith alone. His teaching in Christianity just seemed different. And people were saying it's a breath of fresh air. Like we just feel so much better under the load that Estifanos is taking from us. People's lives are being changed, and as far as you could tell by any account, the Holy Spirit is moving. But this did not go unnoticed. People started pushing back. Attempts were made to call him a heretic. People were cutting off his followers. One of his closest disciples got sent into exile. Estifanos was then put into jail for 3 years because they said, you're teaching against the Orthodox, ordained official Ethiopian church. One of the complaints they put him in jail for was he didn't respect tradition enough. And another one said, hey, he doesn't like our mystical visions, which was something the priests would do. They'd have these visions and tell you what to do. And Estefanos was like, that's not how it works. We don't have to do that anymore. They complained to the overseers that Estefanos was teaching the young people how to disrespect the church, and that Estefanos was even calling the priests magicians by all their illusions they were trying to do. I don't know if that part's true or if that's just something they added on. But either way, Estefanos goes away to jail for 3 years. He wasn't fazed by it, though. He just continued to grow in his own walk with God. And when he came out, his disciples he had left behind had formed an even bigger community. There was even more people following him now. They started calling themselves the Stephanites, naming themselves after Estefanos. And they divided up Ethiopia into different zones. And they said, hey, we're going to send teams of disciples to each zone. When we get there, we're going to work the farms, we're going to make money, we're going to take care of the community, and we're going to make sure we can feed people. And while we're feeding them, we'll share the scriptures and we'll share the gospel and tell them about the work of Jesus Christ. And when we're not working and we're not farming, we'll get together and we'll read scriptures together to encourage one another. And just stopping right there, what a beautiful plan, right? That just they came out of prison, they had plans, they had all these ideas, and they're just so it's just so basic. We're going to read scriptures, we're going to take care of people, we're going to feed them, and we're going to tell them about God. It's just such a kind of beautiful thing. And yeah, I try to think of how many other people I've seen so systematic and so careful with such a plan. The only person I can think of with this kind of planning behind his missions work was Hudson Taylor. I mean, this is a really carefully well thought out idea they had. Now, when Estefanos was a small community of like-minded people, he was somebody you could ignore. But as he's forming multiple communities across different zones of Ethiopia, now he's suddenly, causing a problem. He's suddenly causing divisions within the church at large. He had at least 3 large agrarian farming communities. They were all self-sufficient, and they were forming. They were spreading to towns all over, and people were loving what they were hearing, and they were becoming very popular because they just never heard preaching and teaching like this, just the simple gospel truths. Teaching that took away authority from the priest to cast off sin, but gave it back to God and his relationship with his people. This put such an emphasis on God's word and took away the emphasis at the time of Ethiopia on works. And they took other bold stances as well. They looked at the Bible and they said, hey, Ethiopia, I don't think you have the Ark of the Covenant. You were not allowed to say that. Ethiopia has claimed their entire lifetime that they had the Ark of the Covenant. If you remember when Judith in episode 2 wiped out the Axum Empire, it was because of the Ark of the Covenant, right? But Estefanos said, no, we don't have it. There's no evidence we have it. And the fact that we have to make a model of the Ark of the Covenant in our churches is ridiculous. And that we have to cover it in gold. It's this, big idol, he said. And I'm not going to put it in my churches. And when they would put together churches, they refused to do that. But that was against the rules. Ethiopia said you had to do that. But Estifanos went further and said, hey, our priests, our leaders are not descendants of Israel. They're not Levites. And we don't have to listen to them like they're Levites. He also said, and the kings aren't descendants of Solomon. Like, this is not who these people are. They've made this stuff up, and we don't have to listen to them. And that was going too far. He was now stepping on the toes of the whole church, the whole kingdom itself. He said that document that Amde made back in the day, Kebra Nagas, that thing that says that these guys are kings and they are under David's line, is just wrong. And finally, he said, we need to stop worshiping saints. At that time, they would bow to the Virgin Mary. They'd bow to these saints. And Estefanos was like, that's not in the Bible. That's not something we're supposed to do. And this is bold stuff. The Ethiopian church is a lot like the Catholic Church. This is just what you do. And the idea of stepping on that, the idea that you'd question that the Ethiopian church and kings aren't in divine origin, that this isn't a new Jerusalem, you're just not allowed to do that. And so the king at the time then steps in and has to kind of deal with Estefanos. Now, the king is a really interesting guy himself. He was not actually originally raised to be an emperor. He's the emperor of Ethiopia, but he wasn't supposed to be. The person who was supposed to be the emperor got assassinated. And so he got pulled into the job. And shortly after, the other guy had only been the king for a little while, gets assassinated. And Zara, this guy, is put in charge. Now, Zara had been raised to be the head of the church. He had been raised by monks. He had spent his entire life learning theology. He was trained in theology, and he was really good at it. At the same time, he's this paranoid emperor who saw his last guy lose the job really quickly to assassination. He's big on theology. And suddenly there's this new guy in his kingdom telling him that you're not any of those things that you say you are. You're not a divine king. This isn't a divine New Jerusalem. All of those things are made up. And you can understand why he reacted to that not happily. And Zara himself, kind of just an interesting guy. But he's the one who kind of ended some of the religious controversies. When he first came in, there was this big divide. Should you have Sunday as your rest day, or should you have Saturday and Sunday as your rest day? And that doesn't sound like a big deal to us, but it literally nearly broke the Ethiopian church because it sprang up during those 70 years. Nobody was watching them. And it was Zara who came in, made the compromise, got the divisions, got the people back together and said, we can do this, and kind of saved that unraveling that was occurring under the Ethiopian church. He's a hero to the Ethiopian church. He had saved the day. And not shortly after he does that, this Estifanos guy shows up. And Zara also loves theology. He'll end up writing 3 different books. One of them is a defense of the Trinity, and one of them is the defense of the Nativity, and saying, like, these are real things that happen. We need to respect them. And so Zara, on the one hand, he's this bad guy, and he really is a bad guy. And on the other hand, he loves theology, and he loves the church, and he loves religion, and he's a little bit complicated, as you will see. Zara slowly kind of falls apart, too, in this story. You'll see that in a minute, too. But we get back to Estefanos. Estefanos gets dragged kind of into the courts, and the king is kind of like, hey, to learn if you're worth anything and if I should take you seriously, you're supposed to, as a monk, give me legal advice. And this is kind of how we play ball here. He's basically inviting him to the court and goes, I hear you're running a new thing, but I'm inviting you to the court to kind of play the political game. And one of the ways you do that is you give me advice on legal matters, and I will give you more favor, and maybe I let this whole thing that you're teaching go. That doesn't sound so bad. But Estefanos says, no, thank you. That's not what I'm supposed to do. He says, the king does one thing, and we religious leaders do something else. You have your sphere of influence, and I have mine. And I don't think it's my job to tell you what to do. And likewise, I don't think it's your job to tell me what to do. Well, the emperor hated that. And he goes, so you're not going to play ball, basically, right? He's like, no. On top of that, all the emperors expected you to bow to them when you came to them. That was just, you bowed and paid homage to the divine king. And none of the followers of Estefanos would ever do it. And so he finally just gets frustrated with Estefanos and just starts putting them people in prison. He starts beating them. And he just says, you guys are disrespectful. You don't do things the way you're supposed to do them. And we have no time for people like this in this kingdom. Estifanos and them said, hey, the only person that we should bow to, the only person worthy of that kind of worship is Jesus Christ. We're not going to do it. Estefanos put out books on the triune God, taught his disciples to read the Bible for themselves, taught salvation and grace by faith alone, and that was all that we needed. He went against not just the false practices of the church at the time, but he was also heavily going after the witchcraft of their day, of the pagans of their time. There was tons of that stuff kind of being tolerated, and they said, no more. We need to get rid of the witches and the pagans. It's causing us trouble. Estefanos would get dragged off to jail on multiple occasions. But every time he got out, he went right back to training his people and writing books and trying to get stuff done. He was also, they would secretly send people to the churches in the East to get them ordained so that they could have their own system, but they couldn't tell them they were a part of the Estefanos clan. So they just kind of show up and be like, I'm from Ethiopia to be ordained. Like, who are you? I'm like, I'm just from Ethiopia. Don't ask too many questions. Ordain me. Okay, cool. I can go back. And now I can go work in the Estefanos church instead of in the real Ethiopian church, quote, quote, real. The king and the Church of Ethiopia are really frustrated at this point. Estefanos' movement keeps growing bigger. They're going over and ordaining people, and they're just, in their minds, they're just disrespecting him all throughout. And that word disrespect, I read several academic summaries. They even have like his court documents a little bit, and you can read it. And that's the word they kept putting down, is just disrespect, disrespect, disrespect. I don't know if that's just what they were saying about him, or if that's actually what Estefanos was, that he might have actually been disrespectful, right? Either way, whatever was expected, Estefanos wasn't doing it. And I kind of wonder if maybe this is part of the reason why Estefanos' movement failed. If you look at Martin Luther worked with the princes, worked with the people, and even though to some degree the movement that they started caused the eventually, complete change of the way European society ruled itself, Martin Luther and those guys were trying to work with their political leaders. Estefanos really isn't trying to work with the king. But on the other side of it, Martin Luther's kings and princes aren't calling themselves divine, and Estefanos' is. And so we could see why he wouldn't want to work with them. But on the other side of it, you could see why the king doesn't have any tolerance for division. He's got enemies all around, enemies inside. He just dealt with one giant church conflict, and now he has this new one, and the guy who's in charge won't even try to play ball. It doesn't seem like he really wants to try. The situation is very tense. And I do wonder if some of Estefanos' maybe personality, maybe the very passion that got him to see God's word clearly and the desire to see other people saved might have also made him, maybe he was actually a little disrespectful in court. Maybe he didn't play a little bit more of the court game that maybe he should have. I don't want to say it's his fault. I'm just saying, like, it's worth at least mentioning that it came up over and over and over again, that one word, disrespect. Now, he was originally ordered to be killed by the king. In fact, on multiple times, they were like, just kill him. He's too disrespectful. He's wasting our time.
How much time has passed here? So, his movement here.
Yeah, 20 to 30 years over the course of this time.
So he's been going for, okay.
He's been going, and that's the thing. He gets taken to jail multiple times. He gets told to be murdered. Like, again, the advisors are just like, king, kill him. Just kill him already. And he gets ordered to be killed multiple times. And then, like, at the last second, the king will change his mind and just beat him and send him on his way. And this happens over and over again throughout Estefanos' lifetime since he became a real follower. And again, I don't want to say that Estefanos was disrespectful, but that was at least what him and his followers were accused of. Finally, Estefanos is brought to court again. And this time it's specifically because Estefanos won't worship and bow to Mary. This movement really hit Ethiopia in the 1400s. Ethiopia is kind of starting to branch actually out to the Catholic Church. That Zara guy is actually reaching out to the Catholic Church. In fact, in a little while, we'll talk about the fact that the Catholic Church almost reintegrated Ethiopia back in to its like giant fold during this time. And one thing the Catholic Church pushed back was like, hey, you gotta worship Mary, guys. Well, Estefanos and them go, no, we don't worship Mary, just like we don't worship Ark Covenant. We don't do these things. Mary is not God. And that was just kind of the last straw. They were just like, you're disrespecting the mother of God. You can at least bow to her. And they're like, no, I'm not going to do that. His final words on this statement in court was, I worship God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I will not bow before anything other than this. I will not add to this, not for the sake of the rulers of this world. And they were kind of like, we're done. We got it. We can't do it. You guys there's just no getting anywhere with you guys. We're done with you. They tortured the disciples, attempting to get them to revert back to the Christianity of Ethiopia. They're like, we're going to bring you back into the church by torturing you. Or you can convert to something else, by the way, but you just can't stay in Estefanos' camp. They would beat them. They would starve them. They imprisoned them. They were pretty brutal about it. They would use knives to cut their hands, just cutting pieces of skin off, trying to inflict so much pain that they would give up. But almost none of the Stephanites ever wavered. And that was one of the frustrating things for the king, is like, these guys don't back down. They just stay where they are. In a final act of determination, the king had guards chain the Stephanites and walk them way out into the desert in an exile march in Africa. You can imagine how unpleasant that is. But he kept Estefanos guarded in a hut very close by, away from his devoted followers. According to the story, Estefanos was completely alone, surrounded only by hostile guards. His conditions were terrible. He was underfed, underwatered, completely lacking sleep. He was also nearly 70 years old at this point. About 7 months later, he finally dies. The guards hear him yell out Jesus' name 3 times so loud it shocked them. And then, according to the story, an earthquake shook the land. The guards ran away, afraid that Jesus was coming or something. When they go back to the hut, they see Estefanos has died, and they don't touch his body because they believed he couldn't. And so they got an Estefanos convert that was in the area to come check on him, and Estefanos had died, but the chains on his feet and hand had been broken. Now, I do feel like some of that could be mythological, could have been added on. It does feel like it might have been. It's a great story, cool movie scene. I don't want to doubt that the Lord could have done that for Estefanos, but I do kind of wonder if that's not exactly what happened. At the same time, he does die in this hut, though, away from his followers at nearly the age of 70. He's had a pretty hard life. And the emperor was not interested in Estefanos' body becoming a relic or something like that. So to add final insult to injury to the Stephanites, he forced them to wait 7 days in hot Africa before they could bury the body, which is very gross. You can imagine as a guard how bad that smelled. They were having to guard the body so none of the Stephanites would try to bury it. After 7 days, the Stephanites in the area were then allowed to bury what was left of the body. His followers that were exiled actually heard about this. They came back, they exhumed the body, and they're like, we're going to go put it in a proper burial place. But they did not ask permission. So as they carried this body that they took out of the ground, they were caught by guards. They were then imprisoned and beaten again. After several months, they were let out, and then they took the body, or I guess whatever's left of it, and they were told to bury it outside of Ethiopia altogether. The emperor then rounded up what was left of the Stephanites and asked them to bow to him. But he found that they still did not bow to him. It wasn't just because they were listening to Estefanos. This made him even angrier because he's like, I killed Estefanos and you guys still don't do it. So after the usual beating, imprisonment, and all that stuff, he re-exiles all of them, kicks them all out of the country. He's just not in the mood to deal with them anymore. Many of the Stephanites were brutally martyred during this time. Kind of a wave of violence hits, but after a time it calms down, and some of the earlier followers of Estefanos write his story down, and this is written in it's the only surviving work from this time that tells us Estefanos' side of things. It's called the Gies Acts of Abba Estefanos of Gwendagwende, which I probably messed that up, but I think I did okay. I wish we knew more about it, but this is really, truly the only book that survived. There were many books. They were a very educated group. They really believed in writing, but this is the only one that we still have. So many of the martyrs, so much of the attack and persecution, there was so much just going on for the next 100 years that nobody was able to do it. Even the man who wrote that Acts of Abba Estefanos was then immediately put in 3 years imprisonment and then martyred for just writing that down. So it wasn't good. There may have been other surviving works, but there's also language barriers, translations, and just the fact that the Church of Ethiopia doesn't really want to talk about the story because they still to this day don't acknowledge Estefanos and see him as a heretic. His movement does not last, sadly. Sources kind of say they didn't go completely away all at once. There was a second generation, they had kids. And the new Stephanites never considered themselves like different. They always saw themselves as a part of the Church of Ethiopia, just a different part of it. They would try to take communion with them. They would get their bishops ordained in Egypt, still sending them in disguise. There is even speculation that the second generation of Stephanites kind of blended into the Ethiopian church, so they could go to church in Ethiopia, but they were still considering themselves Stephanites. Sadly, that's kind of what ends up being the undoing of this group. There's a man named Ezra. He was this kind of great leader, and there was a time period where there were no ordained priests for Stephanites or anybody really. And Ezra goes to Alexandria. He goes and gets ordained. He comes back to the Holy Land, but he didn't just come back with the ordination so he could make more priests. He also came back with the knowledge of how to build a watermill, which no one had ever done before in Ethiopia. This, a watermill, you can move wheat and do all these crazy things with it. And so in the small Stephanite community, kind of living out in the middle of nowhere, he builds a watermill, and it's like famous. Everyone in town's like, whoa, check it out. And so people from all over go, this is amazing. We need to build these. This can help us so much with our farming. And so the king hires him, brings him to his court. In the year 1499, says, show us how to build the watermill. And Ezra stays. He teaches the court how to build watermills. He does these things. And Ezra's goal, he's kind of the leader of the Stephanites. He goes, hey, we Stephanites aren't so bad. We're good people. You should really give us a second chance. Come on, you guys can give us another chance. We taught you the watermill, and we can really bring a lot of good things to the culture. But sadly, Ezra's story kind of falls apart because they're still getting persecuted, and yet they're trying to show their persecutors they're good people and they should go easy on them. And so then Ezra kind of starts to change what the people believe in. And so the Ethiopian church pushes him and goes, hey, Ezra, how can we ever give you guys a second chance when you guys won't even bow to the king? And, that was a tenet of Estifanos. We don't bow to the king because he's not Jesus. But Ezra goes, oh, no, we'll bow to the king. Like, we Stephanites, we can bow to the king. It's okay, we'll bow. And they bow to the king. And he goes, well, you guys won't bow to Mary. Oh, no, we're not. Like, we will. And so they start bowing to Mary too. And one by one, like, they just keep getting persecuted. They just keep getting pressured. Like, well, why won't you do this? Why won't you do that? Why won't you do this? And every time they do, the Stephanites under Ezra go, no, we'll do that too. We'll do that too, right? We'll do whatever you want. Go easy on us. And for a time, it does work. They do go easy on them. Okay, we'll do all the things we tell you. You're not so bad. But after Ezra dies, the persecution whips back up again. And because at this point, the Stephanites don't really see themselves as any different than the Ethiopian church. They've already bowed. They've already caved on all the major issues. When this last round of persecution comes in, like right in the early 1500s, it just completely wipes them out. What little is left just kind of gets absorbed into the church when the Muslims kind of start attacking again. And so the Stephanites just fade out. They gave up on everything they believed, and then they just kind of fade back into the Ethiopian church. It's really easy to see huge parallels between what happened in the Protestant Reformation and what Estifanos was doing. They both saw a broken version of Christianity based on works, based on priests. It denied Christ. They couldn't even find Christ in it, and they tried to reform it. They both, Estifanos never used the phrase sola scriptura, but it was very clear he believed Scripture was alone the source of it, and he actually did say by faith alone and by grace alone at different times. It didn't become, he didn't say that wasn't chance of theirs, but that was stuff he did believe in, and he actually said specifically. His followers fought for what really sounds like an evangelical version of the faith, and they stood up to immense persecution. But on the other hand, we don't want to read what happened in Europe into Ethiopia. It's very difficult not to see a beautiful but tragic parallel. But Ethiopia could have been what happened to the Protestant Reformation, that things had just gone a little bit different. It's almost kind of like an alternative history version. It's hard for me not to dream and wish that Ethiopian church had not been, the birthplace of the Protestant Reformation, and had things played out a little bit differently. It really could have been. It could have been that what started in Ethiopia spread to Europe. But that isn't what happened, because the Ethiopian church was completely surrounded by Muslim enemy nations that did not, and a Jewish kingdom inside of it that didn't care, and pagan nations too, that didn't care whether you were a follower of Estifanos or a follower of the king or of Ethiopia. To them, you're all the same. You're Christians, and we don't want you in our lands. And so when the Stephanites would get pushed out, when they were on the run, when they were exiled, there was nowhere they could go. That's why they got jailed so easily so many times. That's why they got killed so easily. In the Protestant Reformation, you could find friendly lords and lands scattered off, right? When things got bad in France, Calvin goes to Geneva. When things got bad in Scotland, he goes to Geneva. And then when things get better, he goes back to Scotland. There were geographical places you could get away and find some safety in. And eventually, the Puritans, they go to North America. You're not stuck. But for Estifanos and the Stephanites, where do you go? You're in Ethiopia. You can kind of go to Alexandria a little bit, but they're not really on your side either. All the same things that you're complaining about Ethiopia are kind of in Alexandria too. Is that everyone around you was just as happy to kill you as anyone else, right? And you're going to go to Europe. Europe is kind of doing the same thing at this point. The Protestants, to a degree, can kind of work with the civil authorities because the civil authorities didn't consider themselves divine kings building a new Jerusalem. But the things were so corrupt in Ethiopia. It was so part of who they were because they needed unity so badly to survive that it was very difficult for you to do that. Luther would have sided with the princes against the peasants during the peasant revolt. This had a profound impact on things, how to properly govern nations. They wrestled with that a lot. And, and sometimes they made mistakes. I'm not sure how much they should have, worked with King Henry, the Protestants, to build the Church of England. And yet they did work with him. But Estifanos and his movement, they couldn't work with the emperor of Ethiopia in the same way because he had like a divine God complex where he was set on the throne to be, King David's great, whatever. And so they were kind of out of luck. There wasn't really much you could do. And there wasn't really a whole lot you could work with there because they were stepping on the gospel itself. There were other things too that probably caused this, but these were the big things that stood out to me that made the Ethiopian movement just not have the same success rate and not even have the same probability of success that the Protestant one did. And remember, Martin Luther and them, when they first started, they didn't know they were going to be successful. John Huss, at almost the same time as Estifanos, is trying to do some of these same things, but his movement does not get off the ground, and they do get pretty much wiped out. The Hussites are persecuted for a long time, and they're just not successful. In fact, Huss and Estifanos are actually contemporaries, and they both die kind of the same way. And so in a lot of ways, maybe those two are a better parallel. But Huss, not quite the same as the other. So we won't go all the way there with that parallel. But before we completely write off the Ethiopian Empire, it is important to note that what they were afraid of was exactly what undid them. The very thing that caused the Reformation to fail is also the very thing that kept them for another 100 years from falling to Muslim empires. They were so terrified of division. The same Muslims that sought to destroy Ethiopia were awaiting. They would attack them on a regular basis. They would raid into their country all the time. They would start wars. They would start rebellions constantly. The emperor demanded perfect loyalty because the Ethiopian empire was dominated by many lords, and many of them didn't want them to be Christian. Politics were always dicey. Don't forget that the emperor himself, his predecessor, had been assassinated. This same excuse, by the way, was used in Europe. The Lutherans and Protestants during their division. One of the things the Catholic Church says, well, you're going to let the Turkish Muslims take over. They're already at the gates of Vienna, and you're going to divide the church right now. But what if the Muslims weren't at the gates of Vienna? What if they literally completely surrounded your land? And the only thing standing between you and them is your emperor and his army, and he needs loyalty. And now you suddenly have everyone going, wait a minute, do I have to be loyal to you? Are you even the king you say you are? That's going to cause problems. What the Stephanites wanted was more than just an offense against his pride. It was a threat to the entire delicate Ethiopian system in Africa by itself. This is exactly what happened. The Muslim invasions and attacks would eventually weaken it to the point that it was almost completely destroyed by them. And they're crafty. A great example of the way the Muslims would attack Ethiopia. There was a Muslim neighbor, and every year he would wait till Lent. And when Lent happened, he would then bring his army over and attack the Ethiopians. And the reason is because they had to fast for Lent. But when your army is fasting, it's not very strong. And this Muslim neighbor knew, like clockwork, every year at the same time they would fast. And he manages to wipe out multiple Ethiopian armies. He kills 2 emperors by doing this because they're weak, they're unprepared, they're fasting, they're praying, and they aren't ready for this attack. It would be as if, George Washington, attacks the British on Christmas. They weren't seeing it coming because this is their holy holiday. This went on for years and years. Again, kills 2 different emperors. This one Muslim neighbor just doing this one attack, taking tons of stuff. Finally, one emperor goes, I'm done. I don't care if it's Lent. He waits for this guy to show up with his army, expecting an easy attack again. And none of his soldiers this time have fasted. All of them are prepared. The thing is, if you attack every year on Lent, the other side of it is they know you're going to attack them on Lent. So they're going to get their swords. They're ready for you. And this Ethiopian emperor kills them and, defeats them. This doesn't happen again. But this is just the kind of stuff that they had to get used to all the time. They were always under these kind of attacks by people who didn't really have any problem with coming after them. The official Church of Ethiopia still considers Estifanos and them heretics, but he does have a powerful and important role to play to the Christians at the time. When later Christians and evangelicals started evangelizing in Ethiopia, they told people the stories of Estifanos and the Stephanites, and they connected them back with what happened, and this helped make people comfortable with coming to Christ. They didn't see it as something, brand new, but they were like, oh, okay, so like there's some history of this in Ethiopia, and it made it more comfortable for a lot of people to feel, okay, I can switch out of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and move into the evangelical faith because it's not brand new. We once had it ourselves. So what happens kind of after this, right? We've seen Estefanos fall. We've seen this kind of Protestant Reformation go down. Where do we kind of go from here in Ethiopia? I told you already that the Ethiopian emperor was really confused. He both loved theology and he also was a very paranoid man. He dealt with multiple rebellions. He dealt with multiple assassination attempts. And he himself wasn't the most social or normal guy. He basically been raised in a royal prison surrounded by monks. No one thought he'd ever be emperor. He ended up getting betrayed by close advisors several times. And he kind of goes a little bit crazy. So eventually, he just kind of, again, in that environment where everyone's trying to kill you, he kind of sees Estefanos as just one more person trying to kill him. At the same time, though, he starts to unleash these things against his own family members. After dealing with so many assassination attempts, he just becomes convinced everyone wants to kill him. Eventually, he is convinced his wife and children are out to kill him. He ends up beating his wife to death. He ends up treating his children mercilessly. His wife will end up dying. When a priest says, hey, you can't kill your wife, what are you doing? He has that one killed too. When you look at it, this guy had kind of lost his mind a little bit. On the flip side, though, he actually grew the kingdom quite a bit, and it had never been as far south and had been as strong economically as it was during his reign. He just did all these different things that were not great, but he was a part of the team that basically led an attack on Egypt and got them to not take Portuguese and Italian sailors prisoners anymore because he said we Christians have to stick together. And that made the Catholic Christians go, hey, Ethiopia, do you want to come back in? And this began a process of inviting Ethiopia to things. In fact, Ethiopia goes to a couple church councils in the 1400s. In fact, one of those church councils was the one where John Huss was burned. So they were kind of there for that. But they were also there for this really big conference in 1441 where the Catholic Church was trying to bring the Coptic and Ethiopian Church back into the Catholic Church. There was a bunch of talks, a bunch of good ideas. People were really on board, but nothing kind of ever came of it. And then 12 years later, the Constantinople falls, the Ottoman Turks take over everything, and the Catholics really are too busy dealing with Hussites and their own problems. No fruit ever comes of it. But for a minute, everyone was really excited and thought the Ethiopian Church and the Coptic Church was going to kind of come back on board with the Catholic Church in the West. European churches, the Europeans were loving it, though. They loved that there was a Christian nation in Africa. When they found out about it, they thought it was the coolest thing. And in general, they were just like, yes, the Church of God, moving on. So on the other side of it, again, on one hand, the Zara guy, terrible to Estefanos, terrible to his family, and super paranoid. On the other hand, he liked writing theology books. He wrote a book about the Nativity, wrote a book about the Trinity, and almost brought the Church of Ethiopia back into contact with the Catholic Church. Just kind of a strange, complicated man. Glad I didn't have to live under him, but he was more than just a one-dimensional character in this story. Ethiopia then really builds a strong relationship with Italy and Spain. They're actually documented, we have evidence that there were communities of Ethiopians now living in Rome by the end of the 1400s, kind of, again, integrating back into the world. Like they're no longer, they're de-isolating. They're kind of connecting with Europe. Now, the Catholic Church and them still don't see eye to eye on this Monophysite, Miaphysite thing, but nobody's calling them non-Christians. However, once the Catholic Church and the Reformation gets going, the Catholic Church starts sending Jesuits everywhere, and one of the places they send Jesuits to is Ethiopia. And this actually causes problems, but not just because the Catholics have arrived. In the 1500s, that threat of the Muslim nation finally coalesces. The Ottoman Turks have been expanding for a while. They've been expanding all over, and they've always been kind of looking at Ethiopia as a problem. Ethiopia is in the way to South Africa. Ethiopia is this big Christian kingdom, It's not unpowerful, but the Ottoman Empire at this point is far more powerful. And so what they kind of would do is they'd send fuel, not actual fuel, but money. They'd send funds, they'd arm the Muslims, and they'd send them to go fight Ethiopia through different sultans. And whenever one sultan lost, the Ottoman Empire would just kind of switch over to another sultan, always trying to get different Muslim neighbors to take out Ethiopia for them. And this strategy was really successful. 3/4 of Ethiopia ended up losing her land. She became deeply weak. And even though Christianity had been kind of spreading out to other kingdoms during this time, Ethiopia was just completely open to a wide, direct invasion. And that's what they did. The Muslims come in, they started burning monasteries, killing monks, pretty much getting rid of all the Christianity. And for about 15 years, they were wreaking havoc. But just as the other sultans had gone to the Ottoman Empire to take care of Ethiopia, the Ethiopians were connecting with the Christians. And so they reached out for outside help too. And they said, look, we're going to lose the only Christian kingdom in Africa if you don't save us. And the Portuguese came in, brought in more soldiers, brought in more guns, and were able to push the Ottoman Turk kind of led armies back. This is kind of like modern politics almost, where two big countries don't fight directly, but they fight with these littler countries. That's kind of what's happening here. And the Portuguese are able to kind of get the Ottoman Turks back, and they give Ethiopia back their land. But these people are exhausted. They've been fighting for years. They lost everything. And now the Portuguese said, because we saved you, here are some Jesuits. We'd like you guys to be Catholic now, basically. And what are you going to say? No, we just saved you. They send one Jesuit named Paez, and Paez is incredibly successful. He had been sent actually originally to Yemen. He was then sold into slavery for 7 years. Him and his partner, another Jesuit, they kept preparing themselves to go to Ethiopia. After 7 years, some other Jesuits in the area found them, bought them out of slavery. His friend died, but Paez survived, and Paez gets to Ethiopia. And he had a profound impact. People were like, he's quiet, he's gentle, he's respectful. The problem is he converts the emperor to Catholicism, but when that happens, everyone else goes, no, we're not Catholic, and a giant civil war ensues. Now, Paz actually hides away during the civil war. He didn't want this to happen, and when the dust settles, the Ethiopian church wins, and the Catholic, emperor is kicked out and dies. So then he actually comes out of the hiding. Paz meets the new emperor, and he actually convinces him to be a Catholic too, and that causes almost the whole thing to happen all over again. But the Jesuits do manage to get some monasteries. They get a Catholic presence going for a while. And yet the new guys who came in, the new Jesuits, were really rigid. They were really strict. They weren't really kind. And the Ethiopians didn't like them. And so eventually the Ethiopians just kick all the Catholics out because they're kind of tired of dealing with Catholic emperors and all this stuff. This is kind of the nicer version of what happened. The less charitable version is the Catholics forced everyone to bow to them and would kill anyone that didn't agree with them. And this caused a bunch of problems. And eventually they were thrown out as seen as just as much of a problem as the Turks were. This just depends. One version is that they were nice, but they were causing problems. The other version is they were strict and they got thrown out of Ethiopia. But either way, they get thrown out of Ethiopia. But this makes them weak to the Turks because now the Catholic countries won't help them. And once again, Ethiopia is kind of on her own. Now, in the 1600s and 1700s, they start having these different philosophers. One of the most famous is Zara Yaqub. That's the exact same name as the emperor from earlier, but it's not the same guy. He lived, 200 years later. And he actually creates his own version of the cosmological argument, saying, hey, everyone has a cause. Everyone was created at some point. So who is the original cause? Who was the original parent? That must have been God. John Locke uses the same argument, but 50 or 60 years later. So these philosophers were really intelligent. They had the idea that all men were created equal, and they read it down almost word for word the same way the European ones would later, but it was just their own ideas they came up with on their own. So they were the 1600s and 1700s weren't that bad for Ethiopia. But then they get this new enemy, and this new enemy is probably one of the craziest group of people I have ever read about in all of my time, Joel. I gotta say, this group of people and the way they decide to take out Ethiopia is just so mind-numbing because of the amount of work it would have taken to do it. And yet they almost are successful in completely wiping Ethiopia out. So there's this group of people, they're shepherding people, and they get this vision. Their leader gets this vision from their shepherding, and he gets a dream, and the dream tells him, you must destroy Ethiopia, or Ethiopia will destroy everybody. And so the leader goes, these people are called the Oromo people. And so he tells all of his people, all the shepherds, everybody, we're going to Ethiopia and we're going to destroy it. And they go, how are we going to destroy it? And they say, we're just shepherds. We're not strong. We can't do anything militarily. We don't have a lot of economic power. But what we're going to do is we're going to go in and we're just going to adopt their children. Any children they don't want, we'll adopt them and we'll raise them to be like us. And we're going to teach their kids and we're going to turn their culture into a Muslim culture through the inside out. Through us, all of us basically are missionaries, the Oromo people, and where every single one of us are going to go into their culture and turn it inside out from the inside, make it Oromo. And we will take care of every person that the Ethiopians won't until there's no Ethiopians left and we're the only ones. Which is crazy. That is the most subversive method I've ever heard of trying to destroy your enemy.
Yeah,
but that was their
pretty messed up.
prophecy. And that's what they decided to do. And in a way, it's kind of like Christian mission work. You know, you go take care of the lost and the hurting and tell them about the gospel. But the thing is, our goal is not to, destroy the nation from the inside out because of a dream from a shepherd. But that's what these people do. And for 200 years, they just constantly migrate into the lands. They take over. They don't actually kill anybody, but they're taking over the lands. They're taking care. They do exactly what they set out to do. And it gets so bad that Ethiopia has to put official constraints around this group of people because they really are taking over. To this day, there's a large part of Ethiopia called the Oromo where they still reside. They took over so much land that's now theirs, basically. And that's, again, just another weird threat that Ethiopia is dealing with, where this unique cultural threat to destroy the kingdom comes in from a group of people who are literally devoted their life's work to destroying Christian Ethiopia and replacing it, but not through war, but through just training children and taking over the land. And this isn't even the only one. Don't forget the Jewish kingdom actually comes back to life at this point too, and also tries to divide. It's just... During some of these times, it's a lot. Ethiopia is not having a good time. And this time they kind of reach back out to Europe. King Louis XIV, he's not really well known. He's well known, but he's not a good guy in European history. But he actually gets along well with the people in Africa. They like him. They're kind of friends for a while. Finally, in the 1800s, this man named Tawardaros, he becomes the emperor, and he has this really weird story. But he tries to reestablish Ethiopia, kind of get things back on track. He builds libraries. He reforms the churches a bit. He's a very humble guy. The British diplomats love him. They say, man, this guy is the most humble dude. He loves his people. And they said the slogan that he always says, without Christ, I am nothing. And that was just this guy's slogan. Everyone loved him. Ethiopia was one of the only two countries to never really be colonized in the world, and one of the few places on Earth, in Africa at least, and one of the few places on Earth Europeans didn't colonize, alongside places like Japan and China and Thailand. But China and Thailand were kind of colonized to a degree. Japan and Ethiopia are really the only two that just don't get taken over by anybody. Even though these places would sometimes be controlled by European interests, Ethiopia managed to survive without having the land taken from him. Well, Tawardaros was one of the reasons that happened. He had a good relationship with Christians, and he took care of them. But one day, he decided that he needed more guns for his country's defense. And so he took some Christian British missionaries, and he took them captive. And he said, basically, I'll trade you these Christian British missionaries for some guns. That's all he wants is some guns. Well, the British send an army and he releases them, and the British kind of go back. And then he kind of looks around and goes, I'm just going to do it again. So he does it again. And again, Tawardaros is a good guy. This is the only thing he does that's kind of a problem, but everything's a problem. So he recaptures the British missionaries again. The British missionaries are like, we're not giving you guns. And he goes, I'm not letting them go. And this begins a 6-year war with Britain. And this war is just so strange. It was very successful from a military perspective. The British hardly lost anybody. They'll win the battle, quote, quote, the battle, and get the hostages out. Yet it's a 6-year complicated rescue mission. It costs tons of money, and it's a complete waste of time, basically. When they finally get to the city where the missionaries are being held hostage after 6 years of traveling, they've got guns and cannons that they've dragged across the desert, and the Ethiopians have spears. So you can imagine that wasn't much of a battle, but getting the cannons and materials there costs so much money and time to drag them through the desert just to have this one little battle. Tawardaros ends up committing suicide because he's about to be captured, but he didn't hate the British people. He said, if he died, send my son to Britain because I don't want an Ethiopian killing him for the throne. And that's exactly what they do. When he commits suicide, they take his son to Britain. And he gets raised in Britain. Queen Victoria meets him multiple times, takes care of him. They pay for his schooling. They really like the son. And it was just unfortunate that at 19, he kind of gets pneumonia, and dies, unrelated. But the boy was safely taken care of by Britain. So this was not a war of hate or anything. It's just a weird war that they have with Britain for 6 years. One person at the time said it was the most expensive operation ever carried out in the name of honor on both sides, basically. As they're leaving Ethiopia with the missionaries that they rescued, they then excavate a site that they didn't have access to. And they basically, for a year and a half, dig up old things to take back to the museums in Britain. The missionaries didn't want to leave. They begged them to leave them in Ethiopia. They take them back to Britain. And within a year, all of them had returned to Ethiopia. So
good for them.
I mean, I don't even know what you make of that story other than this was just, all right, that's just the kind of things that happen. All in all, it's strange. But Ethiopia does not become a British colony. In the late 1800s, Italy tries to take Ethiopia, but Ethiopians at that point had gotten their hands on guns and they defeat the Italians. It was actually, a lot of times we say that Japan is the first one to defeat a European power when they defeat Russia. But actually, technically, Ethiopia, I think, beats them when they defeat Italy. So a little bit earlier. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, many missionaries from Protestant countries are coming to Ethiopia, but much like Estifanos and the Stephanites, they will be persecuted severely. There are stories of Christians that are just being persecuted, martyred, imprisoned, all these kinds of things. And after that, they were invaded again during World War II. For a while, they were captured by Italy, but not considered a colony because it was a resistance thing. It was a war, and they are the first country to get their freedom back once Italy is kind of pushed back, and they helped fight for the Allies through World War II. Ethiopia kept a Solomonic emperor up until the 1970s. In the 1970s, Ethiopia gets kind of taken over by communism, or at least strands of violent communism. They don't technically, sometimes they call themselves communists, sometimes they don't. Kills basically everybody. And they were an actually communist country from 1987 to 1991. Then around 1994, they kind of become a republic. I will say I don't want to comment too much on Ethiopia's current politics, because I don't understand it. So I'm just, if you're a listener, somebody in Ethiopia, go ask them what's going on. I'm going to end it right here at 1994. They call themselves a republic. Some people say they're still a strict dictatorship or something like that. Other people are like, no, we're totally free. I don't know. I couldn't figure it out. And I don't want to comment on that. We're a history podcast. So we're going to say in 1994, they call themselves a republic. Part of Ethiopia does break off and form its own communist country. It's called Eritrea now. They basically branch off and say, hey, we're not with the rest of Ethiopia. They don't consider themselves a Western-style democracy. Eritrea is still very much a liberation communist country to this day, and not a great country you'd probably want to live in. Between Islamic, communist, and Ethiopian Orthodox persecution, sadly, the lives of Protestants in Eritrea are not good. There's less than 40,000 of them, which is less than 1% of the population. And this is due to all the stuff you kind of would imagine: extreme communist presence, extreme Muslim stuff going on. Eritrea is also the nation, you may have heard of this before, where they would take Christians and they would put them in shipping containers in the desert. If you've ever heard maybe that story of persecution, that was where it was happening in Eritrea, this part of Ethiopia that branched off and became its own communist country. One girl was literally just a girl who started attending a Bible study, had just barely been going, and they put her in a shipping container. And she was in there for 2 years before she had died. And many Christians are just openly tortured in Eritrea. Eritrea doesn't really pretend that they're not anti-Christian. Even today, Ethiopia's government, on the other hand, they consider themselves Christian, but it says Orthodox Christianity. That's very different than the Christianity that you would see other places. They have licensing they give the churches, and they directly monitor what is taught at the church. It's kind of similar to what you hear about in China, where they're keeping tabs on what you're going to teach. They oversee hierarchies, and they demand in Ethiopia loyalty to Ethiopia above all else. This doesn't go into some of the other problems in the Church of Ethiopia right now. They've got a huge oneness Pentecostalism movement going on that causes a lot of problems. And they also have a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses, actually, for, considering what's going on there. And so it's really difficult for, Protestant evangelicalism, for what we would all consider Christianity, to thrive very well. And that's kind of where it stands at the moment. Ethiopia has 120 million people. It's a very dense population, one of the densest places on earth. It's 67% Christian, and 31% Islam. But remember that 67%, maybe 60%, 40%, no one's sure with the continued migrations going on. But of that 60 to 70%, 60 or 70%, the actual Protestant number is probably closer to less than 10%. So it's not exactly an easy
You
place
say
to be a
less than
Christian.
10%?
Yeah, I believe it's about 10% for the
Didn't you just say
Protestant.
Didn't you just say it works out to less than 1%?
Oh, that was Eritrea. Eritrea
Oh, I
has
see.
less than 1%. Ethiopia itself, next door, where
I see.
Eritrea broke off, is again probably less than 10%. It's not an easy place to be a Christian, especially if you're in one of those communities that's, like the Oromo people who came in, they're still Islamic or whatever you happen to be. And there's tons of stories of martyrs and stuff like that. Some of them probably end up on Elisa's podcast at some point. So, did Ethiopia's almost Reformation affect Europe? And
So
what do you think, Joel?
Let me ask a couple questions. So I
Go
will
ahead.
say it seems like this Christian nation of Ethiopia really wasn't very Christian for the majority of, like, there's pockets where it seems to be more
Yeah.
Christianese, but I feel like, again, I always felt like it had the stigma of, like, it was just a God-fearing, like
Oh,
pre-America, before America was around, like an Ethiopia, like this pocket.
Oh
But
man.
it
Let's
seems not.
let's stop for there just a second though, because Joel, that's really important actually. Like I had to do a lot. One of the reasons this episode took so long is I do a lot of research because there are so many myths around what Ethiopia is. There's your myth, kind of like this free Christian state in Africa. But then there's this other myth that's really prevalent, especially right now, which is like this black liberation. No one could ever conquer them. Black power, Christian state in Ethiopia too. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that's out there. Some people were even like claiming Judith, the woman who destroys the Aksumite Empire, like this, she's a strong woman and all this stuff. It's insane. Getting to the real story underneath all of that stuff is really hard because everyone has their own agenda of what they want Ethiopia to be.
Mm-hmm. So when most people are talking about like a Christian or the Church of Ethiopia, they're usually just talking about that like 20-year stint of what was his name again?
Estifanos.
Would you say that that's what people are usually referring to?
I don't think most people know about Estifanos. I think people don't really know enough about the Church of Ethiopia to be sure what they're really talking about. And so maybe if you've heard people talk about an almost Reformation in Ethiopia, they might be talking about Estefanos, but I'm not sure that they really know. I think most people don't really know what's going on. What I would say is the Church of Ethiopia is a lot like the church in Europe. At times, the church in Europe is doing good, right? Like you're a Christian in Rome in 200 AD meant something for sure, because you'd be martyred if you weren't. And being a Christian in Rome in 400 AD meant something. But by the year 1400, right? Like that doesn't mean you're a follower of Jesus Christ. You could just be saying that, right? And that's kind of what I view Ethiopia like. There were times when they were walking with God. The Tewodaros guy, the guy who took the Christian hostages, but like he actually seems like a really decent guy that everyone loved until that moment. I think there were probably moments where they were really walking close to the faith. And then there were moments they weren't, much like the actual Israel that they were kind of modeling themselves after. There were times where they were good. There were times where they were bad. I think there were moments where Ethiopia seemed to have a good head on their shoulders. And then especially in that time when Estefanos shows up, they really had lost their way. And sadly, Estefanos was not able to drive them back to where they needed to get to.
The real hero of this story is the hermit, right? Well, the unknown.
Yeah, that's true.
The angel-like figure, it seems almost like that came out of the shadows to share this. Would you say, I mean, when we look at the Protestant Reformation in Europe, a lot of that comes from the masses not having great access to scriptures. It's all in Latin, if you could even get your hands on type of that. And so just the majority of people didn't even know what scriptures could say, let alone, before Luther came along and translated it to German. Would you say that was kind of a similar issue going on there in Ethiopia?
I don't know how much they were kept from being able to read and, read it. It does seem like they had access to the Bible, because remember when Estefanos gets the right idea of it, he starts copying scriptures and selling it. It doesn't seem to be a problem. And so he had access to a Bible, and no one was like, hey, people can't read that.
So it was just so much of the culture that was just...
Yeah. It seems like they just weren't teaching it. It was like the Bible was sitting there and no one knew how to read it almost. Like they knew how to read the words, but they didn't understand what they were reading. And the teaching on it was so distorted that even though the Bible was right in front of them and anyone was allowed to read it, in the Catholic ways, you had to have Latin, you had to have all these things. There doesn't seem to be that barrier. And yet these people don't see it at all. And I think it's kind of, go ahead.
What were you about to say?
I was going to say almost like Mormonism.
Okay, I was going to say it's almost like the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts. How am I supposed to know what I'm looking at unless someone explains
That's
it?
actually really, you're not wrong, actually. It's right there in front of them. They don't see it. Right? I was going to go, it's almost like Mormonism, where Mormons have the Bible, but then they have this other book of all this extra stuff, and it so messes with them, right? And that's kind of what's going on here in Ethiopia. Like, they have the Bible right in front of them, but they have all this extra stuff of kings and queens and Solomonic lines and Arks of the Covenants and New Jerusalem. They have all this extra stuff. And so they're completely lost until someone comes over and goes like, it's just Jesus. It's just Jesus, faith in him alone.
Do we have any evidence? Is there any paper trail that Luther or some of our other
lined me up for it. Thank you. Yeah. So let me tell you, here's why I can say with extreme certainty, no, the Church of Ethiopia did not inspire the Reformation, but with a caveat that the idea of Ethiopia influenced the reformers. Here's what I mean. Martin Luther and the reformers knew of Ethiopia's existence, and Luther pointed to Ethiopia as evidence that the Protestants did not have to stay with the Catholic Church. They said, look, there are other churches that are outside the Catholic sphere, and they're doing just fine. And they point over at Ethiopia, and they say, Ethiopia was a big evidence. It came up multiple times, like, what Catholic Church? Are you saying Ethiopia is not Christian? You guys can't control everything. The Ethiopians seem to be doing fine. This was a really big deal because remember, the Catholics said if you don't read Latin, if you don't pay your indulgences, if the Pope doesn't let you out, you're going to hell, right? And the Greek Orthodox and the Church of Ethiopia were hey, you can't say they're unfaithful. And if you can't say they're unfaithful, we can break away from you too, and we're fine. And that's actually really important. They needed that to bolster their case. And that way, Ethiopia had a very positive effect on the reformers. Calvin mentioned it in his book of John, that, oh, wow, it's amazing that there's these languages. And he said, because Jesus was written in different, Jesus's name was written in different languages, we're allowed to write the Bible in different languages. And then he pointed over to Ethiopia, because Ethiopia doesn't write it in Latin. And yet their church is doing just fine. Remember, you had to write the Bible in Latin. And Calvin used Ethiopia to argue you don't have to do that. He specifically pointed to Ethiopia as one of those places like, this is your proof that you are wrong. And after Calvin, Theodore Beza, he really used Ethiopia a lot in his arguments. So again, Ethiopia as an idea was actually really important to the reformers. So when you hear people today kind of go, oh, Ethiopia was never Christian. No, the reformers, nobody thought that until like really recently, that nothing in Ethiopia was Christian. But here's the problem. The Ethiopia that they're pointing at is the Ethiopia that got rid of the Estifanos. You see what I'm saying? Like they're going, look, Ethiopia's fine. That's the same Ethiopia that had just wiped out Estifanos. They don't know about Estifanos. They don't know about the Stephanites. That book and that stuff doesn't get really discovered till much later. The Stephanites don't survive, and they don't make it to Europe to tell their story. And so when they're pointing to Ethiopia and going, look at the Church of Ethiopia, Ethiopia seems to be Christian and doing just fine. Ironically, they're pointing at the very church that 100 years earlier killed Estefanos and had just finished wiping out the Stephanites pretty much at the time they're getting pointed to as evidence of a good church outside of the Reformation. You see what I'm saying?
But they don't know that. That's unknown.
They don't know anything about Estefanos. If the reformers had heard about Estefanos, they might have liked him. But if they had heard about him, the only people that ever come from Ethiopia are deacons, and they're people who are priests and people who are in, the actual official Ethiopian church. They're not going to tell them, hey, you guys are doing something cool here. Let me tell you about Estefanos, the guy we just got through burning and his movement, right? They all officially still recognize him as a heretic. So they certainly did back then. And so they were going to be like, you guys remind us of the Stephanites. That wasn't going to happen because they didn't like the Stephanites. So there was no one to tell them the story of the Stephanites or of Estefanos and all those cool things that were happening. I would imagine the reformers would have loved it had they known about it, but there's no way they could have possibly known about it. Now, Luther did actually famously meet with an Ethiopian deacon named Michael in 1534, and they did discuss theology. And Luther kind of shared with him what they were doing. The deacon famously said, Luther, you've got a great creed. We think what you're doing is good. And likewise, Luther said, I love you guys in the Ethiopian church. We offer communion to those in the Ethiopian church. Luther didn't offer communion to the Hussites, and they didn't offer communion to Zwingli's people, but he offered communion to the Ethiopian church. He said, these guys are Christians. But again, this would have been an Ethiopian deacon who would have seen Stephanite as a heretic. And at that point, the Stephanites were gone already. There's no way they would have been talking about the Stephanites. It just wouldn't have come up. The Ethiopians were against the Stephanites. It's highly unlikely Luther had ever heard of the Stephanites. And there's no evidence that any of them ever heard of the name Estifanos. It never goes mentioned. And it makes sense. If your only contact with Ethiopia is the official Ethiopian church and you're offering communion to them, what does the Stephanites matter to you? If they had known about them, they would have, again, I think they would have agreed with and liked the Stephanites in theory, but they never got a chance to hear about them. And there's no evidence anywhere, everywhere that they ever knew about any of that stuff going on. Some people point to the meeting with Michael the deacon as evidence that Martin Luther was deeply persuaded by the Ethiopian church to start the Reformation. But of course, this makes no sense because it was already 17 years after nailing the 95 Theses and the Reformation was well underway. We're already way past the Diet of Worms and all that stuff. So at this point, Calvin is almost to Geneva. So, I mean, the Reformation is very much going. Zwingli's already dead, and several Protestants have been martyred across England. So the Reformation's going. This Michael Deacon meeting, again, positive, but it didn't, and I'm not going to say it had zero effect, but I'm just saying the Reformation's in full swing. It would be as if saying World War II did not start until the D-Day invasion. World War II was happening for years. The D-Day invasion was just, one more step in that. And to be honest, the D-Day invasion is giving a lot more credence than this Luther Deacon thing, right, which certainly would be a much smaller affair. How much did the Luther and the Reformers really know the Ethiopian church? Even though the Ethiopian church occasionally sent people to Europe, and not a lot of Europeans made that trip back. And again, the Portuguese came to Ethiopia, but we don't see any evidence that any of the Reformers did. If they had visited Ethiopia, would they have liked what they had seen? Would they have been okay with all the different things going, the Mary worship, the bowing to the king, and all that stuff? I'm not really sure that they would have, right? Like, the deacon is going to sell you the best version of Ethiopia. He's not going to tell you all the practices that they don't agree with. So once again, many times, I don't think these people would have seen necessarily eye to eye. I think they would have loved Estefanos, but he was gone. Finally, it's important to note that this whole episode is not endorsing the Ethiopian church today. We do not.
I feel like what's going on, we've kind of thrown it under the bus.
Yeah, well, I kind of think it's probably not the best. I don't. And I even kind of think it's probably not the best. That's a really soft. I'm going to say it's not the best. What they're doing right now, it does not seem good. And there are many good people who are trying to spread the faith in Ethiopia, and we should be praying for them. Like I said, about 10% of Ethiopia is considered Protestant. They face severe persecution, not just from Islamic people, not just from the Oromo people who are still there, the Somali people that are trying to push their things, but the Orthodox Ethiopian church is just as much of a problem. And according to Voice of the Martyrs, they are just as likely to persecute you and make your life difficult as anyone else will. Again, for whatever we can say about the history of the Ethiopian church and kind of those different moments where the faith was strong, this current Ethiopia is not one of those moments. And so there you have the story of the almost Reformation and the very long history of Ethiopia. And I do feel very confident we can say that as interesting and tragic as the story is, it is not where we get the Protestant Reformation in Europe.
So people that are making that connection, your coffee shop conversation where they're saying, isn't the Protestant Reformation stolen from, where does that stem from? Like, where are people making those assumptions, those connections?
Like so much, if you've been listening to this and you've listened through the 3 parts, you probably have heard, probably a lot of stuff you didn't know. And you also probably learned that, like you said, there were things that you thought Ethiopia was that you weren't actually true. And that's this kind of thing. Ethiopia gets mythologized and gets used by all these different groups of people. And the real truth is that, from my research, what I'm seeing is not those things. And so whoever is saying that, I don't know. They could just be saying it because they saw Estefanos had similar ideas 100 years before. But again, John Huss did too. These weren't the first people to have these ideas. At the same time, though, it just seems like whoever was doing it is trying to take away from Martin Luther and some of these guys and try to pass it to someone else for whatever reason that might be. And we would like the idea that they don't have the free flow of communication that we do today. If something happens around the world, if someone doesn't come and tell you, or the book doesn't get out, you don't know. And the thing was, no one told them the book didn't get out. They didn't know. And so there's just no way for this to cross over.
Fascinating. I feel like I've learned a lot. I feel like I'm much more equipped at handling this topic matter when it comes up in conversation.
And it does. I mean, let me tell you, it's such a point. You can hardly go to Dunkin' Donuts and order a croissant without them being like, by the way, what do you think? Ethiopia,
Let me tell you something.
It's a great story. I love doing this. It's turned into definitely our longest deep dive by like an hour, but I really found this whole story interesting. Sad. Again, really most of it just kind of sad.
Yeah, it's a little bit yeah, you're hoping for better stuff. You're hoping to be
do.
surprised by how awesome it was, and instead I'm surprised at how kind of uneventful it all ended up being.
Yeah, it's almost like it really is an alternate history. If you ever ask yourself the question, what would have happened if Martin Luther and them had died and they had not been successful? Look at Ethiopia today and you're kind of like, okay, that's probably what it would have looked like in Europe. Like that's how razor thin the margin was. But then again, it almost happened in Ethiopia and it didn't. And then 100 years later, it happens in Europe. Would a God have just been like, oh, okay, and moved it over to some other group of people? Maybe had that happen. Like this was going to happen somewhere at some point. The church needed to change, and so regardless, it was going to happen at some point. Or maybe Ethiopia stands as just a tragic cautionary tale. I'm not sure. I hope people learned a lot from it. I hope people can find some things to apply from it. I think, if anything, it is kind of a sadder story of what happens to Christians when they're on their own and they're not able to lean on others for support.
Well, listeners, thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of the Deep Dive series here. I'm pretty confident. I don't want to say 100% guarantee, but I'm pretty confident it will not be such a big chasm until the next Deep Dive series. Again, we were a little bit complicated by some events going on here in Troy, again, moving countries twice, that ended up contributing towards the big gap between previous Deep Dive editions. But we already have our next one lined up, and hopefully it'll only be a few more months until we can bring out the next Deep Dive and ideally we want to do like them quarterly, right? Like once every 3 months or so. And so hopefully we can keep to that schedule there. That'd be the plan.
See you next year, guys.
No. Well, I guess at this rate, I guess we are September right now, so
that's nice. I meant see you like in 2024 at the current pace of how these are going.
But we hope I'm trying to encourage our listener that will not.
I will tell the listener. We already know where we're going next, and it will not take as long. I'm really excited for the next episodes of Deep Dive. So can't tell you what it is yet, but we know where we're going, and it's going to take a lot less time. So,
and of course, if you ever have any recommendations. You've seen Troy's researching skills. They're very good. He when he knows something, he digs into all the crevices. ReviveThoughts@gmail.com. Send us some recommendations. We'd love to explore and kind of do a deep dive on listener recommended subject matter. So if you have any suggestions, let us know and we can add it to the list.
All right. This is Troy and Jill, and you're listening to Revive Thoughts.
So, how does it feel when you play Roll Up to Win with Tim Hortons? Buy a hot or cold beverage using the Tim's app and find out. Roll in the app for a chance to win prizes ranging from free coffee and donuts to a Universal Orlando resort vacation or a sweet car. Oh, don't forget the TV. And this year, every roll is a shot at a $1,000 daily giveaway drawing for 2 $500 prizes. Roll up to win and get treated by Tim's. No purchase necessary. Account registration required. 50 U.S. and D.C. 18 plus entered by 4/2/23. See rules at rolluptowin.com for free entry and full details. Void in Florida and where prohibited.
Hop on over to Meijer for a happy Easter. We're serving up low prices on Easter favorites, like Meijer's Spiral Sliced Ham for just 99 cents per pound. Limit 1. Find all your fresh sides for less. Plus rolls and desserts in the Meijer Bakery. Plus, find more in one stop, like sweet deals on treats and toys. This week, earn 3,000 points for every $30 you spend on toys with M-Perks. Shop the same low in-store prices online and get more for your money at Meijer. Exclusions apply. See all the deals in the Meijer app.